my colleagues will dribble in. Where'd Kathy go? Are you first, Kathy? Why don't you, let's get going. Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd take your seats, we're going to get going here so we're not too late. When my colleagues get here, I'm going to refer to the interesting points you all made when they weren't here and let them wonder what the hell they were. Go ahead, Kathy. Do we have sound?
Testing. There we go.
There you go.
Chair Hoppen, thank you very much for this opportunity to present information on the tools used by the Department of Water Resources, the tools that we use to analyze the hydrology and the hydrodynamics for the Central Valley and the Delta. My name is Kathy Kelly. I'm Chief of DWR's Bay Delta office. We will be covering the CalSim model, the DSM-II model, the CalLIGHT model, which is a quick and easy version of the CalSim model. And also we'll talk about the multidimensional modeling that we've started to get into. DWR periodically issues reports containing estimates for unimpaired flow. And to help clarify the use of the terms unimpaired flow and natural flow, we've included in our submittal to the board examples of when unimpaired flow may be a good representation for natural flow, and an example of when it does not represent natural flow. In our submittal, we also emphasize appropriately incorporating potential effects of climate change into assessments that the board staff may be conducting. We offer to meet with board staff to discuss approaches to these assessments. Eric Reyes he's a senior engineer within the Bay Delta office, and he's an expert in the CalSim modeling, and he will be giving our presentation. He may at times refer to Tara Smith, who's a supervising engineer and very familiar with the DSM-II model, or the Delta simulation model, and our multidimensional modeling. Or he may refer to Parviz Nader-Tarani, who is not only familiar with all of our models, but also very familiar with the process used in the analyses associated with the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. Given this, I want to thank you once again.
Kathy, something that would be helpful to us, and I put Mr. Fujitani on the spot last time we had one of these, but as we try and as we do go forward on this, you know, we get all of these ideas how to micromanage a system, and I recalled Paul and John Lehigh, I think it's John Lehigh, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Some time ago, I think in the Delta Flow hearing, talk about their abilities to manage the system and the efficiencies and the inefficiencies of being called upon to make, you know, micro changes, if you will, on a moment's notice. And I think it's important from DWR's standpoint to make sure that we're all aware of what your operational constraints are, so we don't sit here and say we need to have you do this and we need to have you do that, when in reality the cost of water might be untenable, or it may be practical, it may not. So please don't hesitate to give us a reality check on that as we go forward. Okay. I think that's important.
All right,
not that we'll pay any attention to you, but it's good to say it.
All right.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you.
Are you up, Mr. Reyes?
Good afternoon, Chairman and members of the board. I'm going over CalSim-II, CalLIGHT, DSM-II, and SELFE. These are different models within the department that we use regularly. I'll also be covering a case study with CalSim-II, and then I'm going to go over some definitions of unimpaired flow versus natural flow. So what is CalSim-II? It's a statewide long-term planning model, simulates over 80 years of simulation. It's primarily focused on operations of the SWP and CVP facilities, and it's a monthly time step model. Represents the Sacramento and San Joaquin river systems and the Delta. And really what it does is it accounts for system operational objectives, physical constraints, and then legal and institutional agreements and statutes. Here's a map of California water projects, state, federal, and local. This model primarily focuses on the state and federal portions, and this is a map that shows maybe more projects than what CalSim handles, but it handles everything maybe up to around Los Angeles, in the south and up north to Shasta. Here's a map of the delta, just to let you know the, I guess, main points of interest that the model focuses on. Sac River, east side streams like McCollum River, you've got Cosumnes, San Joaquin River, Contra Costa pumping plants, the state and federal export facilities at Banks and Jones. And then we've got salinity standards that are met at certain compliance locations. The 6 listed there: Edmonton, Jersey Point, Rock Slough, Collinsville, Chips Island, and Antioch. This is a schematic representation of how we represent the reservoir river system of the state and federal agencies. It's basically a link node model, and it is a mass balance type of model, and it represents river reaches, diversions, return flows, consumptive use from agriculture, and things like that. Okay, so now why use CalSim? What's its purpose? It addresses many SWP and CVP obligations throughout the state, and these include local demands, upstream river minimum flows, delta water quality, delta outflow, and then exports to contractors. Another reason to use it, it has the ability to assess operational objectives over a long-term planning horizon. It also has the ability to evaluate potential water supply impacts throughout the state using comparative analysis, which is probably the best form to use this model.
Eric, can I interrupt you for a second? This morning we heard, and I don't know if you were here or not, we heard a lot about the value of models as we try and formulate our plan going forward. When I look at CalSim and the way you're using it here, it's not a hypothetical thing. You're actually using it as a tool to meet your obligations under the myriad of restrictions and flow regimes that you have to comply with. Do you have the ability to physically analyze the results of your predictions? I mean, you know, modeling's kind of an imprecise science in some respects. You're using it to meet your obligations. Do you have a way of going back, maybe not on all of them, but to see if the end results meet what your expectations were through the model?
Yeah, we can, but just by looking at historical, operations and seeing how well they might match what we would predict them to be. But there are certain complications when you're dealing with real-time. They've got issues of fish presence, and that may shut down the pumps or something like that, which our model, we don't have that built in there. I mean, it'd be difficult to try to, develop situations where you would say there is presence or whatever. So our model is very much it's formulated on rules, and these rules are pretty static. So that's the difference between our model and I would say real-time operations.
Mary?
And if I may, okay, I think I'm on now. So, the strength of the CalSim tool is that it's a planning tool, and generally, it's not used in an absolute sense to predict, but it's used in a comparative analysis to compare one scenario to another scenario. So that's really the appropriate way to use the CalSim tool.
Thank you.
Okay. And then the last point about this is it has an ability to incorporate climate change and sea level rise into our modeling, which is, definitely a concern that we all have for the future, and we want to know from a project perspective, if we had to deal with issues like climate change, what kind of impacts would those cause on our project operations. So some CalSim-II limitations, which I think we kind of just got into, but it is a monthly time step model, and so when you deal with, let's say, standards that are 2-week standards, 1-week standard, or 1-day standards, or they begin mid-month, we have to do some approximations because it's a monthly model. So just, a limitation. Also, because it's a monthly model, you lose some of the variability of hydrologic flows at times. And we try to compensate for that as much as we can where we can, but we still do lack some of that variability. And with CalSim-II, demands are aggregated in relatively large geographic areas for the upstream portions. So it has kind of a coarse resolution, and so there's limitations there. As it's constituted right now, it assumes existing water rights rules. I mean, we could probably change that, but at the moment, that's what it's assuming. Imprecise groundwater representation, just because it's difficult to get data, difficult to model groundwater over a large region like the state of California. So we do what we can, but it's a little bit imprecise. And then, like,
is it a little bit imprecise or quite imprecise?
I just think it's hard to even gauge.
I mean, you don't really have data to.
Well, we look at the long term, like, let's say, average pumping that we predict in the model, and we've compared it to recent historical pumping. They're pretty close. So I think, in that sense, if you look at it in a large statewide basis, it's not bad, but I wouldn't go digging in the model and try to find a specific location and try to determine what the heads are there. And, it's more regional.
To that point, I learned a week ago that conservative was kind of a dirty word, but are your flows conservative to the point of being overgenerous, do you think, or are they conservative to the point of maybe not quite meeting, or is there an answer to my question, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to track the water balance, and so, we're definitely not adding or taking water away from the system, through the groundwater and stream water interaction.
But if it's imprecise, which I appreciate your candor, because you would assume that it would have to be some degree of imprecise, do you think you put more water in the system to make sure you're covering your obligation, or is there any pattern to it, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the assumptions in the model is that there's a land use demand that we have for these geographic regions that I discussed. And if the contractors in those areas are shorted, or their allocations are such that they're not receiving the water that they need for this given land use demand, then we just assume that they will pump the groundwater to make up that lack of water. Now, how realistic that is, I mean, it's just an assumption of the model, So the model always assumes that you're always going to have the same land use throughout the entire simulation, which, in reality, you may not have the same land use if you get drier conditions.
I wasn't trying to ask you a loaded question there. I appreciate your attempt to answer it. Thank you.
Well, but you also assume that there is groundwater there to pump as well. Okay.
Yes. And then, so the last point, which we've already discussed, is this model really is more suitable for comparisons than standalone applications, although there are times when, because we don't have there's a lack of anything better to estimate sometimes long-term plan, that we do use it in an absolute sense, but it is really more suited for comparisons. Okay, moving on to another model. This is the CalLITE model, and essentially it's used as a screening model. It's derived from the CalSim-II model, and it takes a lot of its inputs from the CalSim model, but the part of this model that we use to try to do screenings of is for the delta. So mostly we use it to try to make some modifications to the delta region, whether it's operations or, you know, physical structures or facilities. It also simulates the same 82-year period as CalSim, and it's a flexible model in the sense that you can make changes pretty quickly, and it runs in like 5 minutes or less. And it's mostly used just to screen out ideas of potential regulations, operations, or facilities. And we do this through this flexible GUI that we have where, I mean, basically there's buttons you can click on and off to say, you know, yes, I want to, you know, try this certain regulation, or I want to turn that off, or I want to turn on an isolated conveyance, or turn it off. You could change demand levels. You could turn on climate change. And, you know, it's pretty handy, and it helps our management just to come up with some either ideas or to screen out bad ones, I suppose. Okay. Moving on to another model. This is our Delta Hydrodynamic model. It's called DSM-II. There's three components of this model mainly. Hydro, which is the hydrodynamic portion. The kinds of outputs you get out of it are flow, velocity, and water depths. Those flow, the hydrodynamic information is then fed into two other modules of this model, QUAL, which models the fate and transport of conservative and non-conservative constituents. And then you've got PTM, which is a particle tracking model, and it models the transport of neutrally buoyant particles. PTM does have the ability, you know, to put some behavior into these particles, and you know, but we would caution anyone to use it in that fashion, just because, you know, it'd be hard to predict what types of the behavior you'd want to put in there, and it'd be hard to, I guess, calibrate it. Here's a map of the delta, and then an overlay of the DSM-II grid. And, you know, the boundary conditions that feed this model are the Sac River, and this stuff comes from CalSim mostly. You got flow from the different tributaries in the San Joaquin River. And then on the eastern edge, you've got the tidal stage at Martinez. And we have exports as also a boundary condition. And then just inherent with the models too is the bathymetry of the delta channels. That's also basically a boundary condition or an input. And then you have the delta consumptive use also. DSM-II, I kind of referred to the QUAL part. It has nutrient modeling capabilities in this as well. You could simulate things like ammonia, phosphorus, dissolved oxygen. But with this model too, I guess some caution should be taken, just because you need a fair amount of data to run these models at their best, and you know, data is hard to come by. So, but it does have the capability of doing these things if you have the right information. Another model that we have is pretty new. It's been under development for the past year and a half, is the SELFE 3D model of the bay. And essentially this model, we would use it to help us come up with the better estimates for sea level rise, and just different elements of the bay. As of right now, it is a fully functional model that we are using internally, and we're hoping to get it released by the summer of 2013. I mean, mostly we're just working on documenting this model, but it is a model that, you know, we have available, and we're hoping to have it out here pretty soon.
Eric, on the last model you had up there, as it relates to sea level rise, one of the earlier presenters talked about essentially the effort that went into the hydraulic hammer, if you will, to keep salinity at bay prior to pumping operations. Will this be able to tell you, as you have sea level rise, how much more incremental water it will take for that hydraulic hammer?
I'm going to have my colleagues weigh in on this.
Yes, it should. It should do similar than similar as what was shown. The model will be able to do the wetting and drying, so the areas that would be inundated due to sea level rise could be represented. So should be fine with that. That's one of the reasons for using it, which DSM-II wouldn't be able to do. So.
Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention that this is it will be a publicly available model. So this graphic just is kind of like a hierarchy of how the models that we use are tied in together, and this was actually pulled from a BDCP analysis, and it just shows that calcium up at the top is generally our main model that gives us the boundary flows for a bunch of lower tier, more discrete models. So like we showed earlier, CalSim-II feeds it in DSM-II, which then can feed into Qual and PTM. And CalSim-II also feeds into some reservoir and river temperature models. And then all those together go into like full analysis of any particular project or operation we may be looking at. And so that's kind of how we coordinate these models together.
Well, one thing that's missing from this graphic, and I realize it's BDCP based, that a tool you use, but was the new model that the SELFE model that you're working on, which has different characteristics. It's not, link node model. It's a three-dimensional model in some regards. So I'm still, having gone through the 140-page submittal, all of it, I'm still a little confused about, the past, the near past, and the near future, and how these things link together in terms of this, because you're obviously very excited about SELFE, notwithstanding your dispassionate presentation, but your agency's pretty fired up about it based on what I read.
Yeah, that was due to Eli. He did a nice write-up of it. Yes, are you talking more in terms of historical modeling or forecasting?
How does it fit in? I don't want to get too detailed, but just how does that effort, and you say it's for sea level rise incorporation, things like that, but how does that fit within this graphic you have up right now?
Okay, so DSM-II we'll use it for, I would say, kind of basic flow, basic water quality modeling. It represents the system a little bit more simpler than the multi-D modeling that can do all the different flow processes. The trade-off tends to be in computational expense, which I don't know if I don't think that was brought up this morning. So multidimensional models have been around for a long time, but the difficulty has been, first you have to have the data for the models. What's your question that you're asking? Do you need, that complex of a model? And then, do you have a computer that can run it in the time frame or within the deadline that you can do it? So, with DSM-II, you can run 16 years in. Now I think we're down to an hour with our newer version coming out. With SELFE, with the complexity of it, the bay out to the Fairline Islands and the full delta with 31 layers and 115,000 nodes, this very highly resolved model, it's going to be with parallel processing, you're going to get maybe 80-to-1. So it'd take you, if you wanted to run 80 days, it would take you a day to run 80 days. So and that's part of the practical trade-off in terms of the answer. And so but if you need to answer a very complex question, for example, I think What was raised was Ed Gross's work with Untrim, where you're looking at the gravitational circulation and the movement of zooplankton and things like that. You need that level of detail. You can't do that with a model like DSM-II. So.
Good answer. Thank you.
That's what I was going to say, actually, too.
You're doing great. I didn't mean any criticism.
Good recovery, Eric.
Okay, moving on. Now we're going to go over a case study of CalSim-II, looking at Fall X2 requirements. So we're going to do this comparative analysis that we've been talking about. And so we have a base model, and the major assumptions for this base model is that it has a 82-year time frame run period, simulation period. It's future level land use, 2030 approximately. Future level of climate change, 2025. Future level sea level rise, 15 centimeters is assumed. It assumes that we've got the Water Rights Decision 1641 regulations, as well as 2008 Fish and Wildlife Service biological opinion and the 2009 NIMS biological opinion. I guess I need to point out that the temperature and storage requirements under Action 1.2 of the NIMS biological opinion are not modeled in these models. I guess the way they're written, they're pretty hard to achieve. And then also temperature is not an objective in CalSim. So at the moment, we don't have that capability to operate to a temperature objective. So that's the base model. Then our alternative model is the same exact thing, just without Fall X2. So looking at one metric, in this case exports, we just want to show that even with that, you can look at it different ways, and it kind of gives you different answers, and you have to know, how to evaluate them. If you're looking at just this top line is the long-term average, and so this is your exports, and this is combined CVP and SCVP exports. With Fall X2, 4728, without 4927, for a difference of 199,000 acre feet average annual. And, if you looked at now, what would be the impact of a year following a X2 action, which they take place after wet and above normal classified years. If you look there and come up with that average, it shows more of an impact, 335. And then also if you looked at it, just what's the maximum, hit the exports could take under such a situation. In the simulation year 1944, we actually get a pretty big hit of 775,000 acre feet in a single year. The minimum, which is simulation year 2000, was only an impact of 10. So it kind of matters what years you have going back to back from each other. And so with this, we just wanted to say that model results need to be evaluated qualitatively as well as quantitatively. And then also, we want to look at things in a more holistic fashion. So along with exports, you have to evaluate these impacts with storage. In this case is what we're looking at. And this is just a graphic of the time trace of storage. And this storage is Shasta reservoir storage plus Oroville storage just added together. And this is the full time trace over the 82 years. And you could see that when you're operating with Fall X2, these are the years that usually when you're operating in Fall X2 and you see this storage difference at different time periods. And then for this particular case study, we're going to focus on this 7-year period here in the 40s. So this is that same period just blown up. And so this period is interesting because it starts with an above normal year, followed by 3 wet years, and then a dry year, and then 2 below normal years. And so for this above normal and wet years, you see that, you get this storage difference, but then because that's wet and the system there's enough wetness in the system to refill, and you kind of reset. And so in these cases, we're able to come back to the storage of the case without meeting Fall X2. But when you get into a period now where your wet year is followed by a dry year, you see that you're not able to quite get back to that same storage level that you would have had if you were not operating the Fall X2. And so with these, you can also see that, you know, exports are impacted in each of these years as well. And then this is the storage difference here. But and then 44 is that 1 year that we showed earlier that had the largest single year impact for exports. But the storage actually, you know, you have to kind of combine those impacts to say what your total impact would be. But you do see this, you know, extended period where you're running quite a bit lower than the other alternative.
On this simulation, yes, it brings insight into the what if, the comparative, as you point out. Some of the criticisms that were brought of CalSim, which sometimes, to me, it almost doesn't feel sporting in some ways to criticize it, because it's what we have and you're using it and that sort of thing. But even our invited panel wrote some pretty direct criticisms, sure. And then others. How about, let's just focus on one. Could you respond to the idea or the question whether reservoir carryover requirements aren't included? How would that affect this simulation?
By carryover requirements, you mean the ones in the biological opinion? Gotcha. Well, you know, you could, kind of like earlier when I said the models have these, because we're not operating it dynamically per se, we try to put in these rules that are that work over many different kinds of conditions. If we were to put some of those regulations in the model or try to almost game, you know, I don't know if you've heard of gaming, but sometimes you can change just the little outcomes of certain years and try to tease out what it would be like. I mean, we could do that, but it's quite a bit of manipulation, you know, to these models. And, you know, essentially if you were trying to maintain more storage, you know, you possibly could. And actually that's what I wanted to talk about here, is that the storage impacts in this particular instance of the model, you know, are showing that it's some combination of a storage and export impact. Now, if you wanted to not impact the storage, you could change the rules so that it impacts the export more. And it's basically this trade-off that we're trying to balance. And so, you know, we definitely can change the rules to try to meet a different requirement. And so, I guess the only other thing I wanted to say about that is, even with that, I mean, I think storage would still be affected. You know, even if you tried to push as much of the impact to the export as you could, and that you know, with reduced storage, it's going to be accompanied by a reduced ability to meet temperature requirements downstream and in the reservoir. And reduced storage also equates to reduced exports in general. Okay. So now moving on from the unimpaired versus, from the case study, now we're moving on to just some points we wanted to make about unimpaired versus natural flow. Unimpaired flow and natural flow can be significantly different. Unimpaired flow is a conceptual quantity, and it's estimated through various means to approximate what we call total water available at a specific location or locations. Natural flow is also a conceptual quantity, and it's the stream flow that would have occurred naturally if the watershed were not altered by human activity. And so our observation is that unimpaired flow and natural flow quantities are more similar for the upper watersheds, but as you kind of migrate downstream and into the delta, they tend to be, or they get very different. So limitations on the use of unimpaired flow. With this unimpaired flow estimate that we have, there's no channel flow routing. So, you know, water that's appearing at the upper watershed is basically going to be instantly available downstream, so there's no routing per se. And also the assumption is that your levee systems are still in place, and you know, you don't have overtopping of levees, and that's you know, a pretty important assumption. Some of these estimates are based on expert judgment, and you're kind of piecing together data gaps and data pieces, and so it's not precise and it's not always consistent. Direct field measurement and forecast of unimpaired flow, it's possible, you know, but it's very difficult. I mean, I think there's some satellite methods that you can use, but it's pretty difficult to measure that directly. And then because of that, it's also difficult to implement unimpaired flow based requirements in real time. So just, I guess, in summary, in terms of the stuff that we've covered today, I mean, I think it's been said before, but we'll say it again. Models are simplifications of the real physical world, and this should be used with caution for that reason. There are multiple modeling tools that should be used together to examine the California water system in a holistic way. The effects of climate change and sea level rise should be considered in all modeling. And then system objectives and impacts will likely need to be balanced. Kind of like the point I made earlier about is it going to come from storage, is it going to come from exports, or whatever it may be, but there's probably going to have to be some balance because of the different requirements that are on the system. And that concludes my part. Take that.
So while we're loading Reclamation's presentation, why don't I introduce folks here. I'm Mary Johannes. I'm the Deputy Regional Planning Officer. And to my right are Tom Fitzhugh, who's one of our senior modelers, and Derek Hills from the Fish and Wildlife Service, who has a lot of modeling experience, has joined us on this panel. And Ron Milligan and Paul Fujitani are the manager and deputy managers of our Central Valley Projects Operation Office. What we'll be presenting today to you is a continuation of the discussion of analytical tools, focusing on temperature tools and the hydropower effects modeling. We're also going to present a case study to illustrate the need for a suite of tools to be able to evaluate the effects of new standards. And then we'll be talking about operational considerations as related to new standards. So temperature models, before the Central Valley Project Improvement Act of 1992, we did have temperature modeling, but it was of a monthly time step and probably not that precise. CVPIA had specific language, both authorizing the development of tools and partially funding those, so at least Congress partially funded the tools in our budgets. So now we have temperature modeling on the Sacramento Trinity, Feather. Feather, of course, is the state river or state-operated river. American, Stanislaus, and San Joaquin rivers. And the objectives are to improve our predictive capability of temperature versus storage, to support operations that restore fisheries in the Central Valley, and to evaluate the effects of various operational scenarios. And these tools have been developed not just by Reclamation, but Reclamation working with DWR and the regulatory agencies, including the board, and some of the local districts, Oakdale Irrigation District, South San Joaquin, and Stockton East. So this is a graphic of the temperature models as they existed when we did our 2008 OCAP. So as you can see, it's a fairly extensive system of temperature modeling. But my understanding is that these models are used at the beginning of, at least by our operations folks, at the beginning of a season to develop a cold water management temperature plan, but they're not actually used to manage the system in real time. Oop, let me go back. Well, oh, the wheel, okay. Here we go there. Okay, sorry, technical difficulties. So our current tools are largely based on the HEC 5Q modeling system. And this system is, operates on a daily time step for flow and a 6-hourly time step for water temperature. It is a one-dimensional model, but in highly stratified reservoirs, such as the reservoirs of the Central Valley Project, it is actually a fairly good model. The C-Qual W2 model is a two-dimensional model. And in at least a planning sense, the monthly output from CalSim is disaggregated to a daily time step when the models are used in conjunction with each other. We do have plans for improvements. We're working with the fishery agencies and the Corps and EPA on the development of multi-dimensional hydrodynamic tools. And I think fairly importantly, as we're working on integrating water temperature simulation into CalSim, because right now it's not an objective function, as I believe Eric pointed out. And so sometimes when you're displaying the results from CalSim, it's easy to forget what the temperature implications are with respect to those results. So an example of a successful collaboration on water quality modeling is in the San Joaquin River. It was initiated in 1999 on the Stanislaus River, and this was in collaboration with our local entities as well as state agencies. Then it was extended to the Tuolumne and Merced tributaries, and there was funding not just through CVPIA but also through the CalFed Bay Delta program. And in the end, it was extended to the entire San Joaquin Basin, and it includes EC modeling now, so with salinity modeling capability. This is a graphic of the entire system of the San Joaquin River water quality modeling capability. So at this point, I'd like to talk a little bit about, well, our case study will show that even though CalSim is a power planning tool, a powerful planning tool, but it is restricted, as Eric said. It models current operations, water rights, and contracts. And so it also has a monthly time step, and at least in the San Joaquin Basin, it uses perfect foresight. And as I mentioned before, temperature analysis is currently not integrated. So our case study will show kind of the need for that full suite of tools to really understand the effects of various standards. Before I go on to the case study, though, I also wanted to mention that hydropower kind of is a stepchild of modeling sometimes, at least when the water agencies are involved, because certainly CalSim will provide information regarding differences in monthly generation, but that tells a very incomplete story with respect to hydropower. Reclamation does have the Plexus model under contract, and the Plexus model is a very powerful It's called a optimal power flow tool, which means that it respects transmission constraints. It has an hourly time step or a daily time step, you know, whichever you need. And it does simulate all of the dispatch within the Western interconnection, but you can focus on certain areas like California. So whereas CalSim can only tell you the differences in monthly generation, Plexus can tell you how the hydropower generation is used, so the value in terms of on-peak, off-peak, ancillary services. And what ancillary services are, it's the ability of within hour for generation to respond, and this is where hydropower really excels. Hydro generation can ramp up and down very quickly, and which means that it can respond to uncertainty in the electrical system. For instance, if you have load uncertainty, hydro generation is one of the quickest forms of generation to ramp up and down. And these days, as we're marching to a 33% renewable portfolio standard in California, it also provides the ability to integrate wind and solar resources into the system. So another important component of this suite of tools that we're talking about. So the case study, we selected the San Joaquin River flows objective mainly because the October 2011 technical report is out on the street, and it provided some fairly specific goals. The general goal is a salmon doubling narrative goal, but it does talk about a flow augmentation goal, February through June, somewhere between 20 and 60% unimpaired flow. We just heard about the difficulty sometimes of estimating unimpaired flow. Instead of just focusing on Vernalis, it will be, the compliance points will be at the confluences of the tributaries to the San Joaquin, and although there will still be a base flow requirement. So it's a specific or fairly specific standard that we used in this case study. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Tom to talk about, you know, the base study, which is the D1641 VAMP type of operation at Vernalis, and then to talk about how the CalSim model was modified to model the 20, 40, and 60% standards.
Okay, thank you. So yes, I'm going to talk here about the 4 different scenarios that were run for this case study. And so listed here on the slide are the assumption for there's 4 scenarios, D1641 BAMP standards, and then 3 scenarios with the alternative percent of unimpaired inflow standards, 20%, 40%, and 60%. And so this slide shows the assumptions for the D1641 VAMP scenario. So future level of development, which just imparts some differences in municipal industrial deliveries due to population growth, and also some projects that we expect to exist in the future. VAMP releases according to the San Joaquin River Agreement. No VAMP has expired, but right now we don't have anything to replace it with, so we use it as a proxy for whatever standard might occur in the future. Base flow requirements under D1641, and also releases for salinity standards at Vernalis, and both of these are met with releases from New Melones, but are capped in some of the drier years. Deliveries, and this is specifically referring to the Stanislaus, is there's deliveries according to senior water rights, excuse me, for Oakdale Irrigation District and South San Joaquin Irrigation District model per Reclamation's 1988 stipulation agreement. And then there's also a delivery for CVP contractors there, which is 155,000 acre feet maximum, but it does get decreased to as little as 0 in the driest years. And dissolved oxygen standards on the Stanislaus. There are also releases for the Stanislaus flow RPA, and then there's the model. The model does include the whole San Joaquin Basin, so it also does include full river restoration flows on the San Joaquin. So this slide shows the differences in assumptions as you move from the D1641 VAMP scenario to these alternative scenarios. The main difference is there are, in the 20%, 40%, 60% scenarios, there are not releases for VAMP or for the D1641 base flows. Instead, they're replaced by standards at the mouths of the Stanislaus, the Tuolumne, and the Merced, based on 20%, 40%, and 60% of unimpaired flow. And the other main difference is in terms of the methodology used to calculate deliveries. So in the D1641 VAMP scenario and the 20% scenario, the method is the same as was showed on that previous slide for Oakdale and South San Joaquin and the CVP contractors. But when you move into the 40% and 60% scenarios, you can't, if you use those same delivery allocation methods, you can't meet those standards successfully while also using those allocation methods. So there's an alternate allocation method used to calculate deliveries. And this is just, at this point, we're just trying to look at kind of the overall annual water budget and compute if in a hypothetical situation where these 40% and 60% standards were being fully met, how much water would be left over to be delivered in each year based on the water budget in the year. And so what the model does is just in March, it will compute the available water supply based on inflows from March to September. And here we have perfect foresight, which means we're using the actual inflows that occurred and not any kind of forecast. And then subtract from that the releases necessary to meet the flow standards, and the remaining amount of water is what gets delivered. And in addition to that, there was also a computation of how much storage to use in New Melones to augment deliveries in drier years. And I'll talk a little bit more about the usable storage part in the next couple slides. And then the other smaller difference is that for minimum New Melones storage, the standard value in CalSim is 80,000 acre feet. But for the 60% run, I had to use 150 just because there's a relationship between release capacity and storage. And so you have to, if storage gets too low in that 60% run, you can't make the releases necessary to meet that standard. So you have to bump the minimum up a little bit. So these are preliminary results. There's definitely some improvements that could be made in this algorithm. This is, as Eric talked about, some limitations having to do with CalSim, and those certainly all apply here. And then there's even in this model, it's, it's having reviewed the results, it could make some improvements in terms of how it allocates water between different water year types. But I would say that in general, it does do a good job of representing what the probable impacts of higher standards on deliveries and storage. So just a couple slides on how it determines how much storage to pull out of New Melones. So it looks at, what it does is it's designing the water allocation in March, and it determines how much water to use out of New Melones by setting a storage target at the end of the following September. And if that storage target is lower than storage was in February, then it's going to take the difference and apply that water to deliveries. If it's higher, it's not going to apply any storage to deliveries. And the target is set by taking storage in the previous September and multiplying it by a proportion which is based on inflow. So if you look at the two tables, the lower the March-September inflow is, the lower that proportion is. So essentially, if it's drier, you're going to draw down the reservoir further and augment or use storage more aggressively in those years with less inflow.